$2. In 1878 Wyoming, that bought you a decent bottle of whiskey or a meager sack of flour. But for a broken mountain man named Silas Mercer, those 2 silver coins bought him the town's outcasted girl deemed entirely worthless. What followed wasn't merely survival. It was a desperate, bloody fight for redemption. The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range was a sound Silas Mercer knew better than his own voice. For 5 years, the mountain man had lived in self-imposed exile, his heart as frozen as the Wyoming tundra. He was a man composed of scars and silence, driven into the high country by a past that refused to stay buried. He only came down to the muddy, miserable logging settlement of Bitter Creek twice a year, once in the spring to sell his furs, and once in late autumn to buy enough provisions to keep the winter from claiming his bones. It was November of 1878, and the sky above Bitter Creek was the color of bruised iron. Stowe was already dusting the wooden boardwalks. Silas hitched his mule outside Jeb Sterling's trading post, his hand instinctively brushing the cold iron of the Colt revolver on his hip. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke, the smell of wet wool, and the sour stench of unwashed men drinking cheap rye. Silas gathered his supplies in quiet efficiency, tossing sacks of flour, coffee, and salt onto the ruffian counter. He was about to settle his tab when a commotion at the back of the store caught his attention. Elias Cobb, a local drunkard with a reputation for viciousness, was dragging a young woman by the wrist toward the center of the room. "I'm telling you, Jeb, she can wash, she can mend, and she don't eat much," Cobb barked, his voice slurring. "Take her off my hands and wipe out my slate." $30 of debt cleared. Silas paused, his cold blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his weathered hat. The girl couldn't have been more than 20. She was terrifyingly thin, her dress a patchwork of rags that offered no protection against the creeping cold. Her dark hair was matted, hiding her face, but the bruise swelling around her jaw told a clear story of Cobb's heavy hand. She stood absolutely motionless, staring at the floorboards like a condemned prisoner waiting for the gallows. Her name, Silas would later learn, was Clara Jenkins. Jeb Sterling snorted, wiping down the bar with a filthy rag. $30? Cobb, you're out of your mind. Look at her. She's sickly. She's broken. Got that empty stare. I need someone to haul water and scrub floors, not a corpse to bury come December. I won't give you a plug of tobacco for her." Cruel laughter erupted from the loggers and drifters crowding the room. Cobb's face flushed a violent red. Humiliated, he yanked Clara forward, nearly throwing her to her knees. "Fine. Who wants her?" $5. "Who will give me $5 for the girl?" The room fell silent, save for a few mocking chuckles. A girl in that condition in a brutal frontier winter was a liability, a mouth to feed that would likely freeze or starve before the thaw. Nobody wanted her. Cobb raised his hand, balling it into a fist, to strike her for his own embarrassment. Clara didn't even flinch. She just closed her eyes, accepting the blow she knew was coming. It was that absolute, hopeless surrender that broke something loose in Silas Mercer's chest. It reminded him of the helpless things he had failed to save in his past. A younger brother lost to a fever he couldn't stop. Before Cobb's knuckles could connect with Clara's cheek, a massive, leather-gloved hand wrapped around his wrist. The grip was like a steel vise. Cobb gasped, looking up into the towering, shadowed figure of the mountain man. Silas didn't yell. He didn't have to. The quiet menace radiating from him was enough to make the entire room hold its breath. "You're making a mess of the floor, Cobb," Silas rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Silas reached into his heavy coat, pulled out 2 heavy silver dollars, and let them drop onto the wooden counter with a loud clack. $2, Silas said, releasing Cobb's wrist with a shove that sent the drunk stumbling backward. "That covers her." Cobb rubbed his wrist, his eyes darting between the silver on the counter and the lethal stillness of the mountain man. He spat on the floor, snatched the coins, and glared at Clara. "She's your problem now, Trapper. She's your robbling now. Trapper, don't come crying to me when she stops breathing." Silas turned his back on Cobb, an ultimate insult, and looked down at the trembling girl. She remained on her knees, staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes. She expected him to drag her, to strike her, to command her. Instead, Silas unbuttoned his heavy fleece-laid buffalo coat. He took it off and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The coat swallowed her small frame entirely, Wagons outside, Silas said. The ride up the mountain took 3 grueling days. The wind bit through their clothes, and the snow began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets as they climbed higher into the wilderness. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, huddled beneath a mountain of furs and Silas's heavy coat. She hadn't spoken a single word since they left Bitter Creek. Silas assumed she was a mute, her voice stolen by the trauma of living with Elias Cobb. He didn't pry. He demanded nothing of her. When they stopped to camp, he built the fire, cooked the salt pork, and handed her a tin plate. He took the cold side of the fire, leaving her closest to the warmth. He was a man of terrifying appearance. A jagged scar ran down the left side of his face from a grizzly bear encounter years prior, but his actions were startlingly gentle. Clara watched him with guarded, suspicious eyes. In her experience, men only showed kindness when they wanted something terrible in return. She waited for the trap to spring. On the 4th day, they reached Silas' cabin. It was a sturdy, low-slung structure built of thick pine logs nestled into the side of a steep ridge to protect it from the relentless northern gales. It was rough, smelling of smoked meat, pine resin, and old leather, but it was warm and secure. Silas dropped her meager belongings on a cot in the corner. "You sleep there?" he said. Pointing, he motioned to a bedroll near the stone herd. "I sleep there," he said, pointing. "There's food in the root cellar, wood in the shed. You pull your weight, I pull mine. Nobody raises a hand to anyone under this roof. Understood?" Clara gave a slow, hesitant nod. For the first 3 weeks, their life was a silent dance of survival. The Wyoming winter slammed into the mountain with a vengeance, burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow. The outside world ceased to exist. Clara began to heal. The warmth, the steady diet of venison and beans, and the absolute absence of fear worked a slow miracle. The bruises faded. Color returned to her cheeks. She took over the cooking and the mending without being asked, scrubbing the cabin until the floorboards shone. Silas found himself adjusting to her presence. The crushing, suffocating loneliness that had defined his life for 5 years began to thin. He found comfort in the smell of fresh coffee in the morning and the quiet rhythm of her breathing at night. Yet the mystery of her silence remained. The twist came on a bitterly cold night in mid-December. A heavy blizzard was raging outside. Silas had gone out to the attached lean-to to secure their meat cache, armed only with a lantern and a hunting knife. Above the howling wind, Clara heard a sudden, violent crash, followed by the terrifying gutter roar of a mountain lion. Clara didn't freeze. The passive, broken girl from the trading post vanished. She scrambled to the wall, pulling Silas' spare Winchester repeating rifle from its pegs. She checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, a movement completely incongruous with her fragile appearance, and kicked open the heavy oak door. The lantern had been smashed, casting wild, flickering shadows from the spilling oil. The massive cat had Silas pinned against the woodpile, its claws tearing through his heavy woolen shirt. Silas was fighting desperately, trying to keep the beast's snapping jaws away from his throat. Clara raised the rifle. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. Crack, the gunshot echoed over the roaring wind. The bullet struck the mountain lion perfectly behind the shoulder, piercing its heart. The beast went limp, sliding off Silas and collapsing into the snow. Silas slumped against the logs, clutching his bleeding shoulder, gasping for air. He looked up at Clara, who stood in the doorway, the smoking rifle steady in her hands, her eyes burning with an intense, fierce light. "You're bleeding," she said. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was raspy from disuse, but it was clear, steady, and melodious. Silas stared at her, stunned not just by the fact that she could speak, but by the cold proficiency with which she handled the firearm. "You can talk. I have nothing to say to men like Elias Cobb," Clara replied, stepping into the freezing wind to help him up. "And I wasn't sure what kind of man you were. Come inside before you freeze." As Clara cleaned and bandaged Silas' wounds by the firelight, the truth finally spilled out into the quiet cabin. Clara was no simple, abused orphan. Her father, Arthur Jenkins, had been a seasoned prospector. 2 years ago, he had struck a massive vein of silver deep in a hidden gorge a few miles south of Bitter Creek. Knowing the greed of men, he had hidden the map and the claim deed, trusting only Clara with the location. Elias Cobb, Arthur's business partner, had figured it out. He murdered Arthur, staging it as a rock slide. Cobb took Clara in, ostensibly out of duty, but brutally tortured her in, attempt to break her and force her to reveal the location of the silver. Clara had chosen absolute silence, pretending the trauma had broken her mind, knowing that the moment she gave up the location, Cobb would kill her too. Selling me to you wasn't just him paying off a debt, Clara whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she tied the bandage around Silas's broad shoulder. He thought you were a hermit. He thought I would die up here in the winter cold. If I'm dead, he can petition the territory for the rights to my father's effects in the spring, claiming the land by default without my existence complicating the legalities. He's going to spend the winter searching that gorge. Silas looked into the fire, the gears turning in his head. The pain in his shoulder was a dull throb compared to the sudden, protective fury rising in his chest. $2. Cobb had sold an heiress to a silver fortune for $2, expecting the mountain to do his dirty work. He's wrong about the mountain, Silas said softly, looking up into Clara's eyes. And he was wrong about you. Clara swallowed hard. Before the snow blocked the pass, I saw Cobb talking to Sheriff Hoyt and some of the rougher loggers. When the spring thaw comes, Silas, Cobb won't leave it to chance. If he doesn't find the claim, he will come up here to make sure I'm in the ground. Silas reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a stray tear from Clara's cheek. It was the first time he had touched her since he draped his coat over her shoulders at the trading post. "Let him come," Silas promised, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They'll find out the hard way that this mountain protects its own." The rest of the winter passed not in the silence of two strangers, but in the quiet companionship of two survivors forging a bond out of ice and necessity. With the truth out in the open, the heavy atmosphere in the cabin evaporated. Silas Mercer and Clara Jenkins became a formidable team. As the snows deepened, barricading them from the cruelty of the world below, Silas taught Clara the ways of the high country. He showed her how to read the tracks of ermine and foxes, how to pack a wound with arrow, and, most importantly, how to shoot with lethal precision under pressure. In return, Clara brought life back to Silas. She forced him to speak of his past, coaxing out the poisoned memories that had driven him into exile. Late one evening, while mending a snowshoe by the hearth, Silas finally spoke of the ghosts that haunted him. "My younger brother Thomas," Silas began, his voice thick with unwept tears. "We were guiding a wagon train through the Dakota Territory back in '73. We were ambushed by rustlers. I was pinned down trying to cover the wagons. Thomas made a run for the horses to flank them. I watched him take a bullet to the chest. I couldn't reach him in time. He bled out in the dirt while I was trading lead with thieves." Silas looked down at his rough, scarred hands. "I came up this mountain because I figured if I didn't have anyone left to protect, I couldn't fail anyone left to protect. I couldn't fail anyone ever again. I was dead inside, Clara, until I saw Cobb raise his hand to you in that trading post." Clara reached out, her small warm hand covering his massive calloused one. "And you didn't fail, Thomas. You fought for him, just like you're going to fight for my father's legacy." It was during the final weeks of April, as the relentless ice finally began to weep into the mountain streams, that Clara revealed the greatest twist of her father's secret. She had been sketching a map on a piece of tanned deer hide, using charcoal from the fire, carefully recreating the document her father had burned before Cobb murdered him. "My father was a clever man," Clara said, spreading the hide across the wooden table. "He knew Cobb was trailing him. He knew men would look for a traditional mine shaft, a cave, or a digging site in the lower valleys." She tapped a charcoal X near the top of the map. "He didn't find the silver in the lower gorge, Silas. He found it up here." Silas frowned at leaning over the table. "Up here? The granite on this ridge is too hard. There's no ore." "Not on the ridge," Clara corrected, her eyes meeting his. "In the runoff cave, behind the waterfall, less than a half-mile from your front door, the claim deed coordinates place the mother lode directly beneath the very land your cabin sits on. Cobb is going to tear the lower gorge apart and find nothing. And when he realizes the claim coordinates point to the highest peak, He'll realize I'm sitting right on top of it. Silas finished, a cold realization washing over him. And he'll know we are still alive to claim it. By early May, the mountain trails turned to thick, impassable mud. But the lower passes were clearing. Silas spent his days setting up defensive perimeters. He rigged deadfalls on the main trail, strung tripwires with empty tin cans deep in the brush, and reinforced the cabin's heavy window shutters. He wasn't preparing for a conversation. He was preparing for a conversation. The tin cans rattled violently down by the lower switchback. Silas grabbed his Winchester, tossing the customized Colt revolver to Clara. "Stay away from the windows," he barked, slipping out the back door and melting into the dense pine forest. Down the trail, a posse of 6 men waded through the mud. Elias Cobb was leading them, looking haggard and furious. Beside him rode Sheriff Hoyt, a cropped badge, who had long been on Cobb's payroll, and 4 hardened loggers deputized for the occasion, including a notorious hired gun known as Deacon Shaw. "I'm telling you, Hoyt, she's dead," Cobb shouted over the rushing sound of the melting snowpack. "The mountain man took her up here, and she froze. By territorial law, Arthur Jenkins had no other kin. The claim reverts to his business partner, me. But we have to secure this ridge to validate the boundary lines. If we find a body, Cobb," Hoyt spat, wiping sweat from his brow, "you owe me double. This mountain is a death trap." From a concealed ridge 50 yards above them, Silas thumbed back the hammer of his rifle. He wasn't going to let them anywhere near the cabin. "That's far enough, Hoyt." Silas' voice boomed down the canyon, echoing off the granite walls, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. The posse froze. Deacon Shaw instantly drew his revolvers, scanning the tree line. Cobb turned pale, his eyes darting wildly. "Mercer?" Hoyt yelled back, trying to sound authoritative. "Come on down, trapper! We're here on official territorial business. We're surveying the Jenkins claim, and we need to inspect your property for the remains of Clara Jenkins." "Clara Jenkins is alive and well," Silas roared back. "And she holds the deed to this land and the silver beneath it. Turn back now, Hoyt, or you'll be surveying your own graves." Cobb's face twisted in panic's rage. "He's lying. The girl is dead. He's trying to steal the claim for himself. Shoot him, Shaw!" Before Hoyt could stop him, Deacon Shaw raised his pistols and fired blindly into the brush. The sharp cracks of the gunfire shattered the morning peace. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired a single warning shot that blew the hat clean off Shaw's head. The posse scrambled for cover behind the massive trunks of the ponderosa pines. A brutal, tactical firefight erupted in the timber. Silas moved like a ghost, firing and repositioning, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to make it seem like there were 5 men shooting from the ridge. He clipped one logger in the shoulder and pinned Hoyt behind a boulder. But Cobb, driven by absolute greed and desperation, broke away from the group. Realizing Silas was distracted by the gunfight, Cobb slithered up the muddy embankment, aiming to flank the mountain man and reach the cabin. He knew if he could just eliminate Clara, the legal headache would disappear. Cobb reached the clearing behind the cabin, his chest heaving, a shotgun gripped tightly in his hands. He kicked the back door open, expecting to find a cowering, terrified girl. Instead, he found the barrel of a Colt revolver leveled directly at his face. Clara stood in the center of the room, her stance wide, her hands perfectly steady. The terrified waif from the trading post was dead and gone. In her place stood a frontier woman forged in the fires of winter, wearing Silas' spare leather vest, her eyes colder than the Wyoming snow. "Clara," Cobb stammered, raising the shotgun. "Put that down, girl. You don't have it in you." "Murdered my father Elias," Clara said, her voice eerily calm. "You sold me for $2, like livestock. You thought the mountain would kill me." "It's my silver!" Cobb screamed, lunging forward, his finger tightening on the trigger of his shotgun. Clara fired. The bullet struck Cobb perfectly in the right shoulder, shattering his collarbone and spinning him backward into the mud. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the roof. Cobb writhed on the ground, screaming in agony. Down in the trees, the gunfire had ceased. Hearing the shot from the cabin, Silas abandoned his position, sprinting up the ridge with terrifying speed, fearing the worst. He burst through the tree line just as Sheriff Hoyt and the remaining demoralized posse emerged from the trail. their hands raised in surrender. Silas stopped, breathing heavily, taking in the scene. Clara was standing over a weeping, bleeding Elias Cobb, her revolver still pointed at his chest. Sheriff Hoyt took one look at Cobb, bleeding in the mud, then at the fierce, undeniable proof of Clara Jenkins' survival, and dropped his rifle. "All right, Mercer, it's over. Cobb lied to us. Said she was dead. Said it was a routine survey. Take him." Silas growled, walking over to Clara and gently lowering her arm, taking the revolver from her hand. "Take him down to Cheyenne. Clara will be pressing federal charges for the murder of Arthur Jenkins. If I ever see your badge on my mountain again, Hoyt, I won't fire a warning shot." Hoyt nodded quickly, ordering his men to haul the screaming Cobb to his feet. They dragged him down the muddy trail, leaving the mountain to its rightful owners. When the quiet of the wilderness finally returned, Silas turned to Clara. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading. Silas turned to his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her, burying his face in her dark hair. She clung to him, burying her face in his coat, the same coat he had draped over her shoulders months ago. "It's over," Silas whispered into her hair. "You did it. You saved us both." 3 weeks later, Silas and Clara rode into Cheyenne, Wyoming. They didn't go to the trading post. They went straight to the territorial courthouse. With the map and Clara's testimony, they legally registered the $2 silver company, cementing her father's legacy. But before they left the courthouse, they made one more stop. Standing before a frontier judge, the scarred mountain man and the girl no one wanted were legally bound as husband and wife. They used the first profits from the silver mine not to build a mansion in the city, but to expand the cabin on the mountain. They built a massive, sprawling ranch that employed honest men, turning the hidden gorge into a thriving, legitimate enterprise. Silas never had to hide from his past again, and Clara never had to fear the cruelty of men. They ruled the high country together, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most valuable things in the world are the ones that are thrown away. If Silas and Clara's fight for survival and redemption in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with fellow history and Western romance lovers. We bring you thrilling, untold frontier stories every week. Drop a comment below what would you have done in Silas' boots. See you in the next adventure.